Blind tasting is one of the most fun yet dreaded topics for anyone who wants to test their skills and for those who are doing it as a part of examination. Rising to the challenge and identifying the unknown can be a thrill, but getting the wines right is not an easy task. With an ever-growing number of countries and regions producing the same varieties, and with local producers having their own style, and lastly vintage variations, blind tasting is getting harder and harder. With my guest Nick Jackson, Master of Wine and author of Beyond Flavor, we discussed his approach to blind tasting, focusing on the structure of the wine, a system that Nick perfected in the last few years while practicing for his blind testing exam for the Master of Wine, and which have proven successful for him. Blind tasting is subject to personal feeling, but this approach is something that resonated with me and my own experience with the WCT diploma examinations and the way I tested wine. Hi, I'm Mattias Carpazza, and this is the Looking Into Wine podcast. Wine and winemaking can be complex, but this podcast has a simple mission. We want to give you the skills and tools to harness your passion about wine. Through this series, we will shine a spotlight on some of the different regions, process, and concepts that shape the fascinating world of wine. I hope you enjoy the show and your own journey looking into wine. Welcome to Looking Into Wine. I'm Mattias Carpazza, and today's guest is Nick Jackson, author of Beyond Flavor. Nick, you just recently finished your Master of Wine, and was only last year. How did your recent involvement help you to create your book, Beyond Flavor?
Well, first of all, Mattias, thank you very much for having me. It's great to be with you today. To me, there was a really pretty straight line progression between studying for the Master of Wine and writing the book. What happened was I was going to sit the tasting exam for the Master of Wine for the first time in June 2017. And so between about October 2015, when I entered the MW program, to the time of the exam, I was tasting many wines every week, maybe 6 wines a day, 9 wines a day, 12 wines a day in the months leading up to the exam. And I was mainly tasting along the basis that I'd always learned to taste wine, which was really a sort of modified WSET format, which really placed a lot of emphasis on flavors. What I found out during the course of my practice was that I just wasn't consistently getting things right. I was relying on flavor when flavor was confusing me, and I kept on discovering that so many wines could taste alike, and winemakers could do so much to change the flavors of a wine. So it didn't seem to me like a very reliable guide. At some point in this process, I kind of got depressed about it, and I thought, well, what else is there? How am I ever going to learn how to taste wines blind, But then I heard another MW mention this phrase, acid structure. And that kind of got me thinking because obviously I'd always been familiar in the context of red wines of talking about tannin structure. I sort of had a concept of what that was. But to hear someone mention the word acid structure in the context of white wines was very interesting to me, because I'd never really thought about the way that acidity could have a structure rather than simply being, the thing that keeps the wine fresh. And so when I realized that, then I started thinking a lot more about structure in both white wines and red wines. And then before the exam, I started trying to develop some kind of protocol or methodology for approaching tasting based on structure, acid structure in whites, tannin structure in reds. And when I did this, according to variety by variety, I sort of realized that the structures in each variety were different when you held the wine in your mouth for a few seconds. And so then what I did was I wrote down in my own weird language, very personal, that wouldn't appeal to anyone else or would not be understood by anyone else, what each variety's structure was. And then, I took that into the exam. I used this approach in the exam. I was fortunately able to pass the exam. And then after I wrote the dissertation for the Master of Wine, the research paper, which is the last step, I became a Master of Wine in February 2019. And then I spent most of 2019 writing up all those thoughts about structure in the form of the book called Beyond Flavor. So it really was a direct outflowing of my studies.
For me, when I was reading it, it resonated with me because I finished last year my diploma, and when I was doing a lot of tasting, there was always the key on especially on the red, the structure. It was something I always focused on, and then reading your book is sort of start making sense everything. And for me, it was interesting. The acidity structure was something new to me, and definitely after reading it, was something I try to evolve, but I think we can say that some people can agree. It's not everybody can think of this, but I think it's something important to give an interesting point to focus on. How important is for you the quality of the structure in a good wine, and how do you define it?
I mean, I think this really gets into quite an interesting kind of almost philosophical discussion about what I'm thinking about, what I'm trying to do in this book. So on the one hand, it is really, and the primary market is really for wine students who are, confronting blind tasting exams. But more than just being a sort of series of tricks for identifying wines in a blind tasting. And I didn't really realize this when I wrote it, but the more I think about it and the feedback I get from people is that this emphasis on structure really goes to the heart of what makes a variety, what makes it taste like what it tastes like. And this has got quite broad ramifications. Let me use a concrete example here. Take, for instance, Chardonnay. Chardonnay has got what I call a linear acid structure. And now I'm not the first person to observe this, but it has got a very defined shape to it. A linear acid structure means that the acidity is like a horizontal line through the wine. It starts, you feel it right at the beginning when you first put the wine in your mouth, and then it continues at the same level as it crosses over your tongue. And after you swallowed, it's still there, always at the same level. It's just like a train just driving along very consistently, steadily, no peaks or troughs in the intensity of the acidity, just very consistent. It's what drives the wine forward from beginning to end. Now, that's all very interesting. But, in the context of a single variety Chardonnay wine, you might observe, well, that could be what gives the drive or the tension to a wine like white Burgundy or Chablis or whatever. But how about in the context of Champagne? Just because a wine like Champagne has got bubbles in it doesn't mean that the native structure of the variety changes, right? So in a Blanc de Blanc wine, if anyone wants to know what a linear acid structure is, take a Blanc de Blanc Champagne or English sparkling wine, and you see the incredible drive of the acidity of Chardonnay from beginning to end. Now, that's quite interesting by itself. But then what happens if you have a blended wine in Champagne with some red grapes in there as well? Because, for instance, if it's Pinot Noir, and certainly even more if it's Pinot Meunier, those grapes don't have this same drive of acidity. Instead, in fact, they have a quite abundant and generous fruitiness, which is felt on the tongue. So when you combine the two in one wine in a typical non-vintage blend, then you have the drive of the acidity that comes from the Chardonnay, and then you have the fruit in the middle that causes the wine almost to stop on your palate just for a bit, just so you experience that nice juicy fruit on your tongue, and then the Chardonnay acidity drags the rest of the wine forward to the finish. So when you think about it like that, then you realize that it's not by accident and it's not random that Chardonnay and Pinot Noir get blended. They add very useful complementary things that the other one can't offer. And you can apply exactly the same analysis to Cabernet and Merlot, to Syrah and Grenache. And a lot of the reasons why these varieties are blended are revealed by structure.
One adds to the others. They combine together very well. If I was to have like a blind tasting, a flight of 3 wines would be 3 white and 3 red, and I wanted to concentrate on the structure for you and your experience, what would be like an ideal or something to make me realize, yes, there is definitely something different in here?
Well, if I'm when I'm first introducing this concept of acid structure in white wines, then the hardest part of this concept is the idea that acid structure has got a shape which changes according to each variety. So I just talked about Chardonnay having a linear shape to it. Now, the one I always start with, in fact, is not Chardonnay, but is instead Chenin Blanc. So Chenin Blanc has got a very, very interesting acid structure. And of all the descriptions in my book that are a bit weird and a bit crazy, this one is the one that's got the best feedback from readers. the one that they can identify with most, which is that Chenin Blanc has got what I call a crescendo-shaped acidity, which means that when you first put the wine in your mouth, the acidity feels quite low. The wine feels quite soft. But the longer you hold the acidity, the wine in your mouth, the acidity grows and grows and grows until you have to spit or swallow because it's so high. And so it's like a crescendo increasing in volume, like in music, towards the finish, the acidity. So that concept of the shape, acidity having a shape, going from a little to a lot, in the end, like a crescendo, like a hairpin, is something which is a bit crazy and difficult for people. But I think that Chenin Blanc is the best great to illustrate what a shape is. So that's where I start. I do like to do Chardonnay after that because I think the concept of the linear progression through the wine is an important one. And also because a number of other varieties, especially Italian white varieties, have a linear acidity. And then after that, I might choose, there's a number you can choose, but I would probably choose Riesling. Riesling is super interesting because the sense of, I was talking about the train of acidity in Chardonnay just kind of rushing on towards the finish. Riesling is exactly the opposite. If Chardonnay has got a linear acid structure, then Riesling has got a vertical acid structure, which means that the acidity is the backbone, the spine of the wine, or like a stake in the ground, it's a vertical sensation around which all the other elements of the wine kind of turns, the fruit and any sweetness there is, or any winemaking features. But the acidity is this kind of vertical stake in the ground. And so this gives a sensation in Riesling of the wine being quite static on the palate. It's not moving really in the same way that Chardonnay is. Chardonnay is trying to get to the finish. Riesling is just quite happy to hang out there and just sit there happily on the palate. It's a very different sensation.
Yes, this beautiful acidity, as I was saying. And I mean, this, when you were looking at this in the first pages of your book, you were saying that this studying the structure of and especially in the white, helped you with your examination for the Master of Wine. What was the case, and how did studying this help you? So we can give a bit of your background and how you put it to.
Well, I mean, there was a number of examples on the exam, but I mean, to give you one, the first 4 wines on the red wine paper in 2017 were all, the question was, these are all made from one variety, but from different regions. What's the variety? And the variety was Cabernet. And now Cabernet has got a really powerful and pronounced tannin structure. Namely, that in Cabernet, you always feel the tannins on the gums, especially at the front. And they almost always have a kind of grainy sensation, often quite fine-grained, often quite tight-knit, high-quality grain. And, there's various other ways that you can identify Cabernet as well. But I think we had examples from Bordeaux, from Napa, maybe from Chile or South Africa, I can't remember exactly. And so these are very different style wines from very different climates and different ages. But, the tannins remain constant across all these different regions. One of the wines was 20 years old, but it still has the same tannin structure. So when you have that, it gives you a great deal of confidence that you're in the right place with the variety, and then you can focus on the possible regions.
And the thing you do in your book is you divide each grape and you try to give the key interest, the key structure point, and then you go also through the different countries and different areas. How much do you think is related to the different area to a grape variety? Do you think there can be any difference other than the structure? What do you think?
Yeah, I think so. I divide the acid structure and the tannin structure into 3 components: the level of the acidity of the tannin in a variety, the quality or the texture or the type of the acidity of the tannin, what sensation it gives in the mouth, that means. And then in acidity, I talk about the shape, like I was just saying. And in red wines, in tannins, I talk about the location where you feel those tannins in the mouth. Now, what I think is that
Here's 3 great reasons to get the new Samsung Galaxy S21 5G at T-Mobile. 1, it's free for both current and new customers when you trade in an eligible device. 2, T-Mobile's the leader in 5G coverage. So 3, you can unleash 5G speeds in more places with your new phone. Get the new Galaxy S21 free at T-Mobile, the leader in 5G coverage.
Phone via 24 monthly bill credits plus tax. If you cancel credit, stop and balance on required finance agreement may be due. Contact us. Qualifying credit and consumer plan required. See details at T-Mobile.com.
The ones that really don't change according to climate are the last ones. So that would be the shape of the acidity and the location in the mouth of the tannins per variety. Because both the level of acidity or tannin and the type or the sensation that the acidity or tannin gives may change according to how warm a climate is or the winemaking choices involved. But nonetheless, the last things, the shape and the location, do not, whatever the winemaker or whatever the climate is doing. So I prefer to focus on those. Having said that, in general terms, we can make generalizations about varieties, right? We can say that Nebbiolo almost always has high tannins, so we can make generalizations about those things that will help. But what I prefer to do is then, on top of the varieties, is to layer on some knowledge about the types of wine style and winemaking that exist in each country or region. Because one thing you realize, I think, when you taste a lot of wine is that not just regions, but countries have whole styles of wine. Like, for instance, Italian reds are almost always built on a combination of acid and tannins. French wines are all about balance and savoriness or dryness. They always want you to drink another glass. In the New World, for instance, New Zealand makes particularly purely fruited, crystalline, precise, clean flavors from a cool climate. So when you have these kind of shorthands, country by country, and then you can be more specific region by region, then it really helps you, once you've got the variety, to kind of narrow down your options about where it might come from.
The book, I think, for me, when I will decide to do the Master of Wine, if I ever decide, is going to be there and give me a lot of thoughts and something to concentrate on and give a structure to also the way I approach my blind tasting, or everybody can use it. Or anybody is doing, as you say, the students are doing a lot of blind tastings and things like that. What would you suggest to someone who's basically new to blind tasting and they want they think, what would be your, like, what do you want them to focus on? What do you think is?
I mean, first of all, if you're totally new to blind tasting, maybe, I'm a little advanced. Maybe you need to focus on, some more elemental things to do with flavor and things like that. But what I would say, though, I think that the emphasis on variety is very important. That's the main part of the book. I think that's where I have moved the conversation forward a little bit. People have always tried to identify what regions taste like. That's normal. But to try and narrow down your options according to acid or tannin is something which I don't think people have really delved into too much before. And so that's definitely where I would start. And I'd start probably with the most important major international varieties that are grown in numerous different countries. So, your Chardonnays and Riesling, Sauvignon Blancs, Cabernets, Syrah, Pinot, things like that. And just get those down, because if you can learn the structures of those varieties, you'll not only have a grasp on the varieties, but you'll also have a grasp on my whole concept of structure, which you can then extend to other wines, to other regions. I do think also the benefit, this is a kind of really weird thing that you kind of realize when you do this study, is that these really important varieties also have the most pronounced and interesting structures. When I include tons of different varieties in the book, and, frankly, I have a lot less to say about the structure of Marsanne than I do about Chardonnay. But then I don't think people are arguing that Marsanne, as a variety, is qualitatively at the same level as Chardonnay when it's grown in the best places. It is quite interesting to think that perhaps without even realizing it, we have been celebrating these great varieties precisely, at least in part, because of how great their structure is.
Absolutely. I think there is something to think about. And do you think we should still speak about the flavors of wine, or is it something of the past?
Yeah. I mean, this is something I am very clear about. I don't want to abandon, the traditional emphasis on flavor. I think flavors are incredibly important, especially when it comes to revealing maybe the kind of climate that a variety could have been grown in. But what I prefer to say is I prefer to use the flavors, the aromas, as kind of confirmatory evidence evidence that confirms the structure rather than what comes first, for all the reasons I said at the top, because they can be easily manipulated. I think one kind of interesting thing, though, that is going on in the wine world, certainly in this country where I am in the US, is an increasing suspicion about using the language of flavors as being a little bit exclusionary, as excluding people who may not be familiar with the language. Now, this has been interpreted in a kind of political context in terms of alienating people who are not familiar with what a blackberry is, or a blackcurrant, or a lime, because those are not the kind of fruits and vegetables that they grew up with, or what are important or relevant in their culture. But even before you get to that stage, I guess what I really wonder about, our obsession with tasting notes and flavors is the extent to which we're really getting to the heart of the wine. What does talking about flavors really tell us about the identity or the character or the personality of the wine? Sometimes I feel like it's a bit like describing someone's personality by talking about the clothes they're wearing.
I mean, they can sometimes be this in disguise. They may have a lot of beautiful flavor, but then they don't follow with a beautiful structure. And then I think blind tasting is still a bit a personal opinion. But in your book, as you're able to give an extra guidance and extra help to people who want to learn and nail it, the blind tasting exam. As I said, I would probably use it again in your book when I decided to do my future studies. And I wanted to just ask you the last question, because I know you run some webinars and these sort of things, where people can find them. And
yeah, I was talking at the top about the way that the book kind of came naturally out of my studies. Well, I have now an online platform for wine tasting webinars called the School of Taste, and that indeed also came naturally, but this time out of the book. Some people said, look, the book had just been released 2 or 3 months ago, and they said, oh, this is great, but I wish we could learn from you more directly. I just did some initial webinars about how to taste the structure, and so this is good for all wine students, particularly at the upper levels.
Absolutely. And what was the name of the website? I don't think
the School of Taste.
Well, Nick, thank you so much for your time this afternoon. Thank you again for your book. And the book, just a reminder, is Beyond Flavor. The author and my guest today is Nick Jackson, Master of Wine. Thank you for your time today, Nick.
Thank you, Matthew. It's great to be here.
You joined the conversation with Nick Jackson, Master of Wine, or Looking into Wine, author of Beyond Flavors. If you're enjoying the podcast, give us a 5-star review on iTunes or any listening app that you're using now, and tell your friends to subscribe. Also, if you go to mattiascarpazza.com, you can find the donation box where you can help with the growing of the podcast. Also, you'll soon be able to find all the transcriptions of the old episodes. And just a little preview of what is coming up. We will have Domaine Jones, a small producer from southern France. And also, I wanted to say a special thanks to today's guest, Nick Jackson, Master of Wine. Music produced by Samuele Di Nardo. Audio edited by Tommaso Ascoli.
Here's 3 great reasons to get the new Samsung Galaxy S21 5G at T-Mobile. 1, it's free for both current and new customers when you trade in an eligible device. 2, T-Mobile's the leader in 5G coverage. So 3, you can unleash 5G speeds in more places with your new phone. Get the new Galaxy S21 free at T-Mobile, the leader in 5G coverage.
Phone via 24 monthly bill credits plus tax. If you cancel credit, stop, and balance on required finance agreement may be due. Contact us. Qualifying credit and consumer plan required. See details at T-Mobile.com.